Well, good evening and welcome to the DX Mentor podcast and YouTube episode. I'm Bill, AJB, and we're really excited to carry on with a previous speaker, Ralph K9ZO. And we kind of talked about this presentation at the end of the previous one, which was improving your DX experience, in which Joe and I probably have a total of 64 DXpeditions. He has 64 and I have none. And then probably 80 years of DXing together, and both of us came away saying, "Damn, that Ralph knows what he's talking about. We learned some stuff." So
Yeah.
we're excited about tonight. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Ralph, and he can get us going here. K9ZO, take it away, Ralph.
Hey, thank you. Well, we're going to continue with enhancing your DX experience because, the reason we DX is because we're interested in foreign countries. We do like the challenge of working the rare guy and we love propagation, but the whole idea is to learn about different countries. And as I've, spent many years doing this, you run out of new countries to work. So I have lots of things that I do while I'm waiting around for the DX. So tonight we're going to talk about ham radio from the perspective of a geography lesson. And I hope you enjoy this DX Mentor podcast. Bill and Joe put it together. I'm giving a little presentation. I'm in the central part of Illinois in rural Stanford. It's a flat farming area. Our fields are laid out pretty much in square miles. Mm-hmm. So we can navigate anywhere, 20 or 30 miles, right to somebody's house without a map and just by street addresses. So we'll continue on. The audience is anybody that's a DXer that's interested in learning about foreign countries. And when you're waiting to work DX, either trying to get through the pileup or waiting for them to show up, or you're staying up till midnight to try to find that opening, this is intended for you just to give you some ideas of the things that I do while I'm waiting around. So I became DX really early. I was licensed for a couple years. The first summer, I was at the Philmont Scout Camp, so I didn't do much radio. And the next summer, when I was 17, I was with the University of Colorado Institute of Arctic and Alpine Research on a summer project. And then I graduated from high school early and the family moved to London. So I hung out with the G4ALE club, which even today is still active. And I follow those guys on their little portable operations. And I was licensed as G5 antenna tuning unit and then GM5ATU, and I got to operate from Belgium as ON8WF. So I always was interested in radio and electronics and geography. I went to college when I returned and just took classes. And then at some point, one of the guys that was a ham radio operator kind of asked me what was my major. And I said, I don't know. And he said, well, you have to take math courses. And I said, well, I took calculus. And he says, you have a science requirement. And I say, I took quantum physics. Is that okay? And eventually we pieced it together that I could get a degree. And then I continued on there until I had most of the classes that those guys offered. But it made sense to me since I was exposed to Europe and interested in just a variety of things. So I was lucky when I got back. I went on some DXpeditions. I get on for contests. I chase DX. Um, I usually have equipment that's blown up. So right now I'm doing everything with 100 watts. But I always like to rag chew with the DX. And right now my focus is DXCC Challenge and trying to get new countries that way. So there's a little story I ran across that if imagine that you're on an airplane and the person that's got the window seat decides they want to close the window shade. And so you can't see out. And for me, that's like really frustrating because landings and takeoffs are really cool. You get to fly up in the clouds. I see the cloud patterns. That's part of geography. I'm interested in what's the weather. I look at the pattern of the landscape below. What are the fields like? when you take off from around here, you'll see that the fields are square, 1 mile square, and they're really green this time of year. It's corn and soybeans, and it changes towards September. Things turn brown, and then the harvest comes, and it's a very dark landscape where you can see it with covered with snow. So I'm interested in that. We don't have any mountains to look at, but that's why I like the taking off in a plane and looking around. And around here, sometimes you can see different patterns in the fields because we grow hybrid corn, and that is irrigated because it's so valuable. They don't want to risk having a poor yield. So we will see squares that are irrigated. But as you fly around in some areas, you'll see circles that are irrigated. You can tell what kind of crops grow. I like to look at the lakes and the rivers and the mountains and figure out, well, where are we, when we're flying around? And then also figure out, well, where are cities located? These are all topics that a geographer is interested. And when we continue on a little bit, also, I'll show you why it's important for DXing to realize some of these big patterns. So let's think about what is geography? I mean, yeah, it's maps and capitals and description, but and aside from the physical geography, we're interested in biology and culture and things on the Earth's surface. And we look at, what are the people like? What do they do? And we're trying to understand what's happening on the Earth and why is it so complex? And it comes down to where are things located and why. And when I drive into town, I look at things differently than most people. They just put in a Starbucks right at the interstate. It's in one of the poorer, rundown parts of town. And I scratch my head and I say, if I'm driving, I'm not going to go to Starbucks and buy that expensive coffee. I'll go to McDonald's, but I won't go to Starbucks. So I scratch my head and I think these guys didn't do their research. You go drive by there and there's no cars in their parking lot, and all the fast food places are busy. So that's something that a geographer does. And when I do things, I guess it's a little bit different than maybe some of you guys. So here's an idea of why geography is important to DXing. I try to, since I'm working on DXCC Challenge, I keep track of what's happening on 6 meters. So from the Midwest here, sometimes we'll hear some Caribbean stations coming through, and then maybe we'll see a YV pop in. And you see those guys are up north and they're a little bit closer to us. And that gives us a hint that, hey, maybe 6 meters is open a little bit further than just the Caribbean. And it's most likely we're going to see like a YV5 or one of these guys that's on the coast. So you kind of need to know the call districts within these countries. There's only a couple guys in Colombia, the HKs, so they'll come through. Panama is pretty rare. Guyana is really rare. And let's say the band opens a little bit better and we start seeing some PY8s. Those are the northern parts of Brazil. And then maybe we hear some that are, here's some PY5s. And those guys are a little bit further south. And if we're lucky, we listen a little bit longer and there's only like one or two guys in Bolivia. If the band is opening into Brazil, maybe we have a shot at getting the rare one from Bolivia. Likewise, Paraguay is pretty well. But you see, a lot of places, they're like the United States. We have call districts by number. But let's say the band matures better and we're hearing Argentina. Well, in Argentina, their call districts are by letters of the alphabet, not by numbers. So if you hear an LU1 or an LU7, it doesn't matter. They're the same. But if it's like an LU with an E or an A, that's in Buenos Aires, which is kind of in the northern part. If the band matures a little bit more and we start hearing some LUs with a W or an X or Y, those are the very southern part of Argentina. And maybe we'll be able to hear something like the Falkland Islands coming through. So that's why it's important to get into the detail. This is geography in my mind, but we really tie it into ham radio.
Huh. It's good to know because I haven't worked. I do the DX marathon. I haven't worked Bolivia in 2 years. And I can't tell you why. I've not been able to work them contests
There's
or anything.
one or two guys on, and that's
Yeah.
it. It
And
would
I
be a
think,
great place for a expedition.
I
So
you know,
here's
still
I,
need,
another thing. Go ahead.
I still need them on 6 meter. Yeah.
Me
It's tough
too.
to
They're
get.
on my hunt list. So
Yeah.
here's the other thing. While we're looking at the green color of Brazil, it's a
interesting.
huge country. If we were to overlay this on a map of Europe, it's as big as Europe. And from east to west, left to right, that distance is longer than it is from like the PY7s to Africa. They have a great shot. So it's over 3,000 miles to get across the country. But those guys, when they're in a contest and the PYs can work the Africans and Europeans, it's a little over 2,000 miles for them to get Africa. So we
Hmm.
have to we see some of these things that are, we wonder why these guys do really well. They've got a clear shot across water to get into to Europe from there. So let's continue on.
Yeah, very cool.
Here's what I did years ago. I can remember I was the kind of guy that read the encyclopedias, the World Book encyclopedias you got in the grocery store. And so to learn about things, you had to have actually books and encyclopedias, go to the library, get National Geographic magazine at home. You would talk to the DX guys on the air and find out about their countries, or you could visit them. So, I mean, some of the earliest books that I had were basically a dictionary, but it was a geographical dictionary that had basically a paragraph about each of the terms or each of the places and cities. And then a couple books that I've always liked, A Thousand Places to See Before You Die. It's got about 1 page description. And then, we're interested in those remote places. So the Atlas of Improbable Places is cool. 100 places to remember before they disappear. And I'm thinking, wait a minute, we're talking about deleted countries kind of thing,
Yeah.
or political changes. So I have, a box full of maps from a long time ago. You guys remember what a card catalog was?
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
And look through. So that was the old school. I mean, that's how I started years ago, getting more information about it. Well,
So
now,
Ralph,
yeah,
if I get the 1,000 places to visit before you die, and I visit them all, is that bad?
then you won't die.
Oh, okay.
But it's a good motivation, a good goal.
Yeah, very cool.
So I'm lucky. I mean, when we moved out here, there was kind of no infrastructure to this house and the place. And I spent 2 years and had contractors and me. I had 150 things in this house to fix. And you'd think, why would you want to be at a place that needed so much work? But it was new. They weren't craftsmen that built it. So, like building, getting the internet, I had to go through 6 different companies to get something that was really reliable. Because there was videos of where the hell is Matt, because he's going to these unusual places in the world, and it's like unusual places. That's what we're interested in. And I was just amazed. Here he was. He showed up in this neighborhood that 20 years later, when we're in Argentina and we have that extra day and we're doing some tourist stuff, and the bus drops us off in this neighborhood, and I'm thinking, I've been here before.
Huh.
During COVID, there were some songs that were trying to kind of be uplifting, encourage people. Jerusalem, and they had a dance step that they taught, much like line dancing, and then the song in many different languages, and that'll keep you entertained because here's these people in cities that we know about and countries that we know about, kind of, and it became an internet sensation. But it was interesting. One time I was not too long ago. I'm talking to a guy in Namibia, and there's only about three guys that are active there, and I said, your prime minister was good enough that he joined in on one of these equivalent to a line dances. And like, I'm thinking, a lot of presidents wouldn't do that. And he says, yeah, I read about that in the paper and what he did. He was familiar with this whole thing. So, I watch, the travel stuff. I'm in Wikipedia all the time. It's, one of my favorite places to donate to. And
Yeah.
so let's talk a little bit maps. That's what we normally think of as geographers. And like, well, here's a pretty useful map right here. if you're on 6 meters of VHF, it's like, this is great. You hear a guy and he gives you his grid even on FT8. You know which way to point the antennas. You can get an idea of how far away he is, where Skip is. And so I use this. You'll notice that the DNs and the CNs are in the northwest part. And a lot of guys from here need Alaska on 6 meters, and it's pretty hard. But if you just listen around and say, hey, there's some California, some CM stations coming through, and maybe there's some CN, it works its way north a little bit, and then you find some Canadian. So here's what I'm talking about is this is the population distribution map. Of course, you'd use that in a contest to say, oh man, everything like east of the Mississippi, that's the population center, or else towards California. When you're on 6 meters and you say, I'm hearing these CM stations in Seattle, and then you'll hear some VE7s, Vancouver, and then you'll think, oh, the band's dead. I don't hear anything. But look at between Vancouver and headed up towards Alaska. There's nobody's living there. So how are you going to find a ham radio guy to be on there to tell you that the band is open? So this is where you're chasing DX, but you're really watching YouTube and learning stuff and reading things, but you're paying attention to, the band was doing the right thing. It was open to the Pacific Northwest, to a couple Canadians, and again, there's not much population there. And then maybe you'll hear that KL7. So that's why it's important to realize between Vancouver and trying to get up to a populated area like Anchorage, there's going to be times where you think the band is dead. And the same kind of thing is true if you're trying to get Hawaii. Well, there's nobody in the Pacific from California until Hawaii. So there's going to be kind of a pause period in there. So that's why I look at these population maps, and it kind of gives you an idea of where you want to be pointing your antenna for both contests and, when you're getting really serious about DXing.
Huh.
So another thing that I look at, and let's talk a little bit about some of the low band DXing. I mean, I've been pretty lucky because before I moved out here, I barely could get 100 countries. I mean, KV4FZ couldn't hear me on 160 even. With just marginal antennas out here, things work, and I have, the good 80-meter thing. But the thing that's important to realize is, where is the sun like right now? And when is our sunset? When is their sunset going to be? These maps here are useful because there's a couple different definitions of when sunset and sunrise is. I mean, before you can actually see that red ball of the sun to come above the horizon, those areas to the east of us, they're in full sunlight. And we divide just by 6 degrees, 12 degrees, 18 degrees above the horizon. That's kind of the magic time. And the same thing is true during sunset, which would be on this, you can use the same map here. But during sunset, during a sunspot low, it might be 3 in the afternoon, and we can work Europeans, and it's still daylight out during a sunspot low. So you have to know that kind of change. But 30 meters is going to be your hint. You'll get that first. In fact, there were a lot of times at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, right after lunch, you could start working Europeans on 30 meters during the sunspot low. You can't do it now. And then likewise, a little bit later, as it gets later in the afternoon, you start getting 40 meters. So you have to realize that, there's a big advantage to getting there early because there's not as much competition, but we have propagation before it is really dark on the low bands. And here's one during the solstice. And the thing to notice how the lines are getting close to being vertical. Mm-hmm. And the other thing to notice too is, so here we are at darkness time, but Africa is in full daylight. So we're not going to be able to hear a lot of those African guys, but you'll hear the OHs come through. And we see the same thing too, even on 15 meters, we get propagation over the north where it's dark. So I did one. If you use this time and date website, look at the difference here. There's a twilight that begins when the sun is 18 degrees below the horizon. But look at the difference at 3:43 a.m. and at 4:28 a.m. twilight starts. And you can have a twilight in the morning and at night. It's the same kind of thing, but it's almost 45 minutes different. So the trick is when you're looking for this DX, you show up early. You're listening there. There's not as much competition. When they announce, and I use Alexa all the time, Alexa, when is sunset? I'll probably kill my connection. I use that all the time to find out roughly when is my sunset, but I can also ask Alexa, when is going to be sunrise or sunset in Tokyo and get an idea. It's like, I'm trying to work them, but it's 4 o'clock in the afternoon their time, so we're not going to have propagation. But here's the trick, when there's sunrise at 5:29 in the morning today. Civil twilight is when streetlights technically have to be turned on, but at 5 in the morning, even at 4:30 in the morning, the sun is starting to rise. If you were, looking for 20 meters or 15-meter openings, you can catch them very, very early. You don't have to wait till sunrise. At 1:03 today, the sun was at the highest part above, and that's why I was out mowing the lawn. And likewise, sunset. So right now our local time is just a couple minutes after 7. So we've got an hour and a half before sunset, but it's still going to be twilight until roughly 9 o'clock. At 9:30, we're still going to have low band propagation, and 10:30 at night, that's when the sun is really well below the horizon and you have a chance. But look at that, 14 hours and 47 minutes of daylight for today.
Mhm.
So
You-
here's a couple little facts
You know what
to
that
quiz
brings
you
up,
on, but
Ralph, I don't want to interrupt you, but I think what all of this brings up is I think a lot of guys rely on spotting networks and texting and clusters and all this stuff. And you get to a point you can't beat being in the seat. I mean, if somebody asked you, hey, it's what's the best time for you to work Japan? You're in front of that radio so much, you know. And I think a lot of guys miss that by just waiting on spots. And yeah, they get to work those, but they miss some really great openings where they could, really have some great QSOs. And that's what I find fascinating about this whole thing.
all right. So there was a cluster. There was just a question that was on the contest reflector, not necessarily the right place, but a guy said, "Hey, my son's moving down there, and the hurricane had just gone through there." And he said, his son's girlfriend was going to go to veterinary school, and he wanted to know, well, are there some hams down there? And what's a good band and time of day? Propagation times by band. And it's like, wow, they're close, 24 hours a day, we have propagation there. And if you want it reliable, there's 3 bands almost all the time. So it was pretty easy for me just to write him back and say, well, here's how you do it. But I don't think there's very much standing on that island as a result of the hurricane that just made it through. But you can do that same kind of thing when you're planning out, well, how do I get someplace in Africa and when's it going to be open? And another thing to remember is for the Africans, it's just like us trying to work Caribbean and South America. It's straight south and it's really easy. So those African expeditions, they have an easy shot into Europe. They have 6-meter propagation that we're not going to get at all. So my thing is, well, I have plenty to do because I got the internet and I can read about the country and what they're doing. And I'll just wait, because I know, we're second tier. They got to work Europeans. And sometimes, and Joe, you know what it's like when you get to a place and you get on, it's pretty much chaos and you're not that efficient the first day or two. You're just trying to work down, work all the lids that you can to get them out of the way. And
Yeah.
then you can really start being efficient.
Yeah.
So let's get back to some other geographic facts. That there's a lot of remote stations starting to show up now. And Maine is so good. It's the closest state to Africa. And you might think, wait a minute, I thought Florida would be close or Virginia, but Maine is the closest US state. And that's shorter distance than if you're in Florida trying to work California. So those remote stations that we have in Maine, they're really close to Africa. They've got a great shot into Europe. It's hard to beat. I had mentioned earlier that Brazil, it's further across over 3,000 miles from one end to the other of Brazil. And that's further than it is for the Brazilians on the East Coast to work into Africa. So I'm puttering around, I look and I see, geez, this is a strange little fact. The connecting flight between Westray, Scotland and Papa, Westray, 1.7 miles airline flight. But that's the way you could get from one island to the other. The plane flight lasts 90 seconds. And then it starts thinking, that's the distance of the runway in Edinburgh. So speaking of Scotland, it's true, the unicorn is the national animal of Scotland. And since my call sign is K9 Zanzibar Oscar, I'm always interested in Zanzibar or YouTube videos that show that place. And, the shortest war on record was 40 minutes between England and Zanzibar. So here's the things you just realize. It's like, I told my grandson he had been to the Panama City airport and they just changed planes and that was about it. But I say, that city is in both North and South America. Or what about Istanbul, Turkey? It's got Europe and Asia in the same place. And then the Vatican, it has ATM with instructions written in Latin.
Holy smokes.
So who would guess? Just a geographer.
Yeah.
So then you start looking, you're flying in the plane and you start seeing the rivers in Europe and you say, geez, look at this long river, the Danube, and it flows through different countries, 10 countries, in fact, through this same river. And you realize that these places through history, they are all actually tied together because of that. And there's an idea of, all the different places that it goes through. And it's good to look at these maps because you see, well, wait a minute, Moldova is generally hard to work for us and it's far away. Romania's got some pretty strong signals, and then you start realizing, well, there's a lot of mountains, and so there's guys with good radio locations. The same thing in Bulgaria. And you look at, Albania, they've got a good shot, just like the guys in Italy. To me, Italy is like Florida. They're south of a lot of the European countries. They've got water around them. Those guys do really well after the band is closed. I got interested in flags because they tell a lot about a country. And so I started looking up, well, what flags have only red, white, and blue? Because there's others that have red, white, and blue, and then a parakeet. Well, that doesn't count because there's purple in there. But you look at how many flags have got red, white, and blue, and they also, these colors, depends what country, symbolizes it. And Bill, I've got another presentation on just the symbolism of different colors and what they mean in different countries. But you'll get an idea of, it's a fairly common thing to have red, white, and blue in your flags. Let me talk a little bit about Nepal. There used to only be one station in Nepal, 9 and 1 mm.
Yeah.
And I always enjoyed talking to him because he'd pick me up because he went to school in this area. So he'd always want to know, it's like, well, what is it green? What's the landscape like? How's the corn doing this year? And the soybeans. So I could always get through, even if he was doing a pile up and he'd want to have a little bit of a rag chew. So he did some amazing work in the 1950s that he started a school, and it was basically for poor kids that couldn't get an education, and it became the oldest school in Nepal, became a high school, and then they included girls. So 75 years ago, this place is still here, and it's really to me interesting that now we have the internet and we could research whatever we want, and you can see pictures of this building and the floor
Wow.
plans and who's the director and the phone number of the place. So we can get into lots of detail about what used to be really rare to find any information about it. So we're talking about what countries start with the letter Z. We just, that just comes to mind because of my call sign. And we got Zimbabwe and Zambia. But whatever happened to Zaire? It's like, wait a minute, what happened there? Well, if you can remember back to 74, when George Foreman and Muhammad Ali fought, it was in Zaire. But in 1997, Republic of Congo changed their name. And they're also called, because there's some confusion, that there's a couple places that were Belgian Congo. So they name it Congo Kinshasa after their capital. And then there's also right by there, Congo that was a former French colony. But the cultures of the two are very similar. And they call that Congo Brazzaville. But wait a minute, there's more countries like that. When you look at Africa, we've got 3 Guineas: Guinea-Bissau, Equatorial Guinea, and Guinea. And then I put in for us, it's easier because we know their radio prefixes.
Yeah.
But you start looking and it's like, well, the countries are really different. Here's Guinea, 3.5 million people. The capital, to keep it straight, they call it Conakry. And then what it's known for is Ebola, what they mine bauxite for aluminum, diamonds, gold, and it's French speaking. Guinea-Bissau, which is a bit to the north of there. The reason we don't hear these guys is because they don't have any electricity. They don't bring it in through power lines from other places. They don't have a hydroelectric dam. They don't have resources like coal that they could burn to make electricity. There is a ship docked at their capital city that has generators on it that supplies electricity to the capital city. World Bank financed it $50 million. So once you get out of the capital city, you see some little generators and some solar power, and that's it for power. So you wonder, why can't we hear this place? It's because if anybody, lives outside of the capital city, they really don't have much in the way of electricity.
Wow.
Portuguese. So this guy is a Portuguese one. And just to give you an idea what's around it, there's Senegal, which on an average day you will not hear. There's Guinea, you won't hear. And then Guinea-Bissau, you're not going to hear those guys. So they're rare. So if you're chasing DX, you have to have something to do while you're waiting for activity in places. So here's another Guinea in Africa. But look at this, position 161 out of 179 in the Press Freedom Index. So this one, they speak Spanish. The thing that's an interesting fact is that it's the only Spanish country south of the equator in Africa. And when we look at a map of it, I mean, here's the kind of rectangular shape is the country, but then there's also a northern island. And then we, as hams, Sao Tome and Principe, we consider that's a separate country. Annobon is a separate place. So there's another thing that we can do sometime in the future is compare what we think are countries compared to the United Nations and CQ magazine. And there's some good discussion. But wait a minute, there's still another Guinea, Papua New Guinea, P29 in the Pacific. And then we have 2 deleted countries that were also New Guinea.
Huh.
So I like FT8 because it is a good way for weak signals. And that's where some of the activity is. And it's really cool when you work with some of the Chinese guys and you look at the marginal antennas or a fishing pole hanging off of a balcony. And these guys have a chance to kind of work DX. But I'd rather rag chew with the DX stations and learn about them. there are places that are not countries, but they still have some activity. So I'll mention Rockall. There are enclaves, Russian areas that are entirely surrounded by other countries. And then historically, the British had forts, outposts that became countries or cities or fizzled out. They issued stamps and coins. I think that QSLing is diminishing, but I always liked getting QSL cards and stamps from foreign places. But there's a big advantage to Logbook of the World. You just do it. But I have some stamps and coins from countries that no longer exist. But I'm spending my time reading about DX while I'm waiting for it to happen. So here's United States money. If you look about coins and currency, here's US money. It's like kind of boring, isn't it? Look how interesting their currency is and how it tells you something about the country. And they call if you don't know anything about the Maldives, and then you say, well, look at the kind of trees they have.
Yeah.
It's more like palm trees. Or you say, wait a minute, I don't recognize the money from Vietnam, bottom left corner. It's like, what language is that? And here's Cook Island coins, which it was interesting because I picked some of these up when I was there, and it's like, who knew there was a triangular shaped coin?
Yeah.
Ah,
But if you've been to the Cook Islands, you say, well, there's no place they can mint these coins. I don't even know if I think you can get stuff printed. There's some photocopy machines, but their coins in Cook Islands used to be made in Germany, and now they, since 1997-ish, are made in New Zealand. But again, you can see their association with the Queen of England,
Yeah.
and then also some of the bottom two on the left get an idea that they are somehow associated with the Pacific cultures.
Yeah.
So I like stamps that come from places that aren't countries anymore, like Zanzibar was, but isn't anymore. But there's still, if you're islands of the air, you're still interested in contacting Zanzibar. They call in stamp collecting, call them we call them deleted countries. So it's interesting that a lot of these are prior to having radio in the early 1800s, areas that are not countries. The one we'd be most familiar with is East Germany. It's a deleted country. Might think of them as countries, but the definition of country kind of changes a little bit. So there's some that aren't quite meeting DXCC criteria. There are places that are almost like an Indian reservation in the United States, tribal homelands in Africa. There are basically areas in Russia that are almost self-governing. They almost want to check your passport before you go in. And I learned about these because I followed Itchy Boots, and she was from Netherlands, so she could kind of go anywhere she wanted, and she's going places that we couldn't get to. And I had mentioned British Outpost, and then we'll get into some detail about unclaimed areas. Nobody wants the land. And then
Huh.
there's disputed areas where more than one place wants the land. And then there's some areas that are kind of shared. And it depends where you got your license from, or you got two licenses and you can be in two countries at the same time. So here's one that I think is really cool. Rockall off the coast of Scotland, and you can see their encampment. So they got some like guys that like climbing and some crazy radio guys. And there's a little pole that was their antenna, and they were up there in the end. I mean, the weather got so bad they had to get rescued by a helicopter. But it was really cool because the money that they collected for the QSL cards, they donated all to a local fireman's fund. But this is a kind of a cool one because you look at it and you say, there's some pictures where the waves are washing over top of this. So it doesn't count as a DXCC, but it's an IOTA.
Didn't they just activate that this last like winter or early spring?
Yes,
Yeah.
yeah, and that
Okay.
was so cool because they're out there. Propagation is going to be really good, and there's salt water all around, but they're just absolutely marginal kind of conditions. I mean, there's their tent there. They had to have stakes in order to like hook it onto the rocks so they didn't get washed away. So that's kind of the radio in the extreme. And speaking of rocks,
There's Glenn.
the Northern California DX Foundation had inherited a rock collection, and they realized, you know, there's places that are United Nations countries that we chase, but there's other places. So when I saw this at Visalia and I'm talking to Glenn and he sent me the list, and it's like, wait a minute, I have like 6 of these rocks that you don't have. Because I like get them when I leave. And then my sister went to Korea to visit a couple months ago, and I kept harping on her, you got to bring me back a rock. And she brought me back a rock, and we sent it off to Glenn. So there's some fairly common places that we still don't have rocks from. But I thought it was just kind of an interesting thing when you look at that and say, wait a minute, there's a rock from Glorioso. Here's one from Reunion. Here's one from Clipperton. Here's some that are regular countries, Andorra or the Gambia. And then there's some that other places would say, Revilla Gigado, XF4, that's part of Mexico, but for ham radio guys, it's a separate country. So to me, this was another way to weave in some geology.
Joe and I brought back a rock from Peter the First,
Wow.
but it melted by the time we got back. So
Yeah,
I guess it was snow.
it was white.
Yeah, it was we thought it was limestone. Who'd have known?
Oh, man.
We didn't know much about rocks back then.
No.
Did reservations, and there was a plan to say, hey, we can develop these into places like Las Vegas, and we can get, and we still have it, and they were issued licenses and call signs, but they never were counted as DXCC countries, and eventually they kind of faded back into where they originally were. But it was fun to chase these around on the hope that they would become DX countries. And they issued stamps. That was the other thing that was kind of interesting.
Huh.
So an enclave is a piece of land that is politically attached to a larger piece in the area, but it's not connected to it. So it's completely surrounded by some foreign territory. And we would think, oh, it's got to be a separate country. But historically, it might be a city or a village that was very much isolated, and another country kind of claimed it. But it's actually fairly unusual. So in 1990, Transnistria declared its independence, but no United Nations member recognized it. So if it's not United Nations recognized, well, it could be a DX country, but it never became a formal country. It's still part of Moldova, and only a couple other of the territories in that area recognize it.
Wow.
So the thing that's interesting, if you start going and look at these videos and you say, man, as a US guy, could I go there and visit? But it's just fascinating to look at these places that are sort of been isolated and they're self-sustaining, and we don't hear about them because they're not separate countries, but they've been independent for years and years. Part of this is occupied by Russia, and part of it is kind of autonomous.
Very interesting.
So here's a place that does not count for DXCC because it's not part of a country. It's not part of any country. Nobody wants it. So Bir Tawil, it's fairly big, almost 800 square miles, and it's between Egypt and Sudan, and it's uninhabited desert, and neither country wants it because it's uninhabited desert and there's no real value to it. And there are old treaties that say if you have this land, then there's other things that you have to take care of, like there's a port city, and then you have to maintain that. And so nobody wants it. Well, and there it is. You see, it's kind of that yellow, green chartreuse kind of territory. Um, but nobody wanted that. So the thing that's interesting, of course, you and me think, but that's a ham radio country.
Yeah.
It's like self-governing, even though there's nobody to govern. So, it dates back from colonial period. And because of the agreements, neither of them really wants that because it's less valuable. And it's just, there's no access to the sea. There's no village or people there. So guess what? There were two expeditions there, 2016 and 2018. And UA9 USU, which we recognize, he said, well, he had a website almost as a spoof and says, vote for me. I want to be king so that we can make this into a country. And then this was a picture from the website. But he had, like a big 4x4 track machine to get there, going through the desert. It's just fascinating. So here's another place that's kind of unusual, and you don't hear about some of these places. They're hard to get to. It takes, a lot of effort to get there. But recently there was a Sable Island expedition, and all of these places you go to that are pretty rare, they've got some secret history to them. That they have these horses that have two heads.
I've been to Sable, Ralph, but I don't remember seeing those horses.
They're really rare, let me tell you, Joe.
That reminds me of a push-pull amplifier,
Definitely.
Oh, gee.
So I made a list of places here, that we recognize and put the prefixes so we would know where they are. And here's, places like, there's some expeditions and they're hard to get through. They're far away for us for the most part. Tuvalu is an interesting place. Marshall Islands, and we know about Scarborough Reef.
Yeah.
But here's the hint: the average height is 3 feet above sea level.
Wow.
So with climate change, I'm predicting these are future deleted countries.
You might be right.
So here's Tuvalu, and we'll go into detail into one, and we got to kind of watch the thing because the longer we delay, the more slides I add to this because I keep finding good stuff. But it's just it's in the middle of nowhere between Hawaii and Australia. But what's kind of cool is its internet domain is a .tv, and they've set up money to try to maintain their culture. So that's going to be one of the first that's lost because of climate change. But they've created this virtual online world to preserve their cultural heritage. So they've got pictures and who lives there and what the houses were like and their songs and their histories and their customs. That's being maintained in a virtual world. But I'm saying we better get there and activate it quickly because here's one of the problems. It won't be long before the rest of this road is underwater. A lot of the people are being relocated to Australia and New Zealand, but they've kind of met the quotas on the number of immigrants. It's hard to grow your like little vegetable garden because it's starting to get salt spray and killing the vegetable plants. But this kind of describes the situation in Tuvalu that they're kind of running out of land.
Huh.
And we've been lucky, we had in the past expeditions, and that's where I like looking at the coins and seeing now they're tied in with the British Empire. So let's talk about borders and countries because it depends on the definition of what is a country and what's the border and how do they measure it. we typically thought there's a border between Botswana and Zimbabwe that's only 512 feet of common border. And that's pretty small. But the other one that's really interesting is between what we think as EA9 and CN8. It's a 128-foot border between these DXCC countries.
Okay.
The longest border between the US and Canada, 5,525 miles long. And then we always think of, well, what countries does Canada have borders with? And it's the US and Denmark. Now, the Denmark border is small, but Greenland touches Labrador. There's water between it, and Greenland is part of Denmark.
Gotcha.
So we think of Denmark as being in Europe, but they've got Greenland touching it. So that's kind of interesting. And then there's some disputed borders, and we know what this is about, but this one's more fun when you kind of get involved in it. Oh, there's the one on you notice that on the EA9s, we think of Malaya as being one of them, but there's a number of little places that are Spanish right along the border that are also islands. In the upper left, right near Gibraltar, we have another one. So we think of those two, but there's other little places that are not terribly activated. But here's that 128-foot border. You can see almost in the very center of this picture, there's a little bridge. These used to be connected, but there was a storm. And so the place that we see that looks like it has a castle on it is now actually separated. But there's the short border of 128 feet between these two DX countries.
Huh.
So let me talk about Hans Island. It's right there in the middle of the water, and it's dividing Canada and Greenland. And again, Greenland is actually part of Denmark. But these are two pretty sane and reasonable countries, so they're not going to have some war about this island. Here's what the island looks like.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, the border goes right down the middle of it, and there's a little bit of discrepancy about well whose island is this thing? So the Canadians will go there and they'll put a little bottle of Canadian Club as a gift and put a sign there that says welcome to Canada. And then the guys from Denmark, like Natural Resources Department, will go there and plant their flag, and they'll have a little gift. Well, eventually this went through Parliament, and they settled there, just basically draw a chalk line right down the middle. It's a formality that they're not gonna fight over it. But I thought that was kind of an interesting thing when we look at border wars. So there's a couple places where you can go that are in two countries at the same time. Morakulian, which I have not heard for years, but it's an international park between Norway and Sweden, and depends where you get your license from. You can be in the same club station and be in either Norway or Sweden.
Hmm.
Okay, here's another test for you. What do these countries have in common? Lesotho, San Marino, and Vatican City. They're all entirely surrounded by another country.
Yeah.
So I guess you have to be like friends with your neighbors, or you'll be stuck. So Vatican City is totally inside of Rome, San Marino's Italy, and Lesotho's South Africa.
What about C3 Andorra?
I haven't researched those guys yet.
Yeah, that's surrounded.
That's what I thought.
Yeah.
All right. So we'll have to come back. I'll make notes.
Yeah, it's pinned between the it's been complete. Well, it's surrounded by two countries. France to the northwest, east, and Spain to the southwest.
Okay,
But they
so
are
that's
Yeah.
That's the trick. The other guys are one country only
Yep.
surrounded.
Yep. Okay. Well, we were just checking up on you.
That's good.
Work in progress.
So
Okay.
if we were Russia and decided we wanted to like build something inside of Kazakhstan, this Cosmodome, and donate this, and like a big stadium, and there's a large area, 56 by 53 miles, and then right in the center is this great big stadium, and then it's inside of Kazakhstan. Is that a place that we could say is a DXCC country or not? Because it's Russian territory, Russian controlled inside of Kazakhstan.
Huh.
And there's a couple of other places that are like villages that are totally surrounded by Russia, but they claim to be independent. And they have kind of so little value that, the discussion never comes up. So watch the time, let me know how we're doing. But I was reading about flags because I like those, and I came upon the flag of Brazil. And the stars in this flag, they're not in a pattern like we have in the United States, but each star, the size of it depends on the population of the state, and it's located where the state is. So if you could take away everything and just leave the stars, you would see that it's very close to the shape of Brazil, the biggest star being Rio de Janeiro, the capital city. So there's your like geographic facts when you get into what's happening in Brazil. So this map shows you the different states of Brazil and the capital cities. And again, going back to one of the early pictures we showed about some of the fascinating things about Brazil and how long it is from east to west, but yet how close it is actually to Africa. So here's the idea. And I think our time is about right. DXing is to me has been fun because I learn about countries, the people, customs, what they eat. I mean, I'm looking up recipes, trying to beg my wife to make some of this weird stuff. And her hobby is cooking and healthy eating. And I come up with these really oddball recipes. It's like, I don't know where you get like this dried beef. When I had it, they just hung it out on the clothesline for a couple days. But you learn about the history and geography, and hopefully you're lucky you get to go visit some of these places. And I can remember in the South Cook Islands, we went to a church on Sunday because they allowed us to sit in the back in the balcony because we were dressed in like jeans and t-shirts, kind of DXpedition stuff. But all the women were in their fancy bonnets, and the singing was known kind of all over the world. And so expeditions that I've enjoyed, we've tried to do something a little extra to make it interesting for us. So there's my guys that were playing baseball. That's a picture from last night. We had a really good camera and pitch black. We're able to get the little bit of sun before the tornadoes came in the area here. So that should do it. I've got plenty more brewing for other presentations. This one is hard. It's a preview. Well, you kind of need to know how many countries are in each continent because that's multipliers. And then you realize Asia, it's really hard to work some of those places. And if you start getting into, well, what's the landscape like, or like in Sri Lanka? It has tornadoes, it has floods, it's got mudslides, and it's like that's a really rough place for us to contact. It's far away, and you start looking, and here's the sunrise and the sunset, and it's like I don't know if I can even work them on 80 meters. It's going to take us a special devoted expedition to do it. So I think that will conclude. If you have some questions, there's
Yeah, I got a couple. One of the things that always fascinates me about the hobby is, even when sunspots are down and everything else, you can pretty much work Japan, when you have to. And I mean, right now it's a chip shot, but even another 6 years from now, you'll still be able to do it. But even now, as well as everything, it's hard to get China. It's hard to get some Indonesia. Certainly hard to get East and West Malay, and that's just fascinating to me because it's kind of the same neighborhood. It just doesn't go that way, you know. And I think that's one of the interesting. I'm curious too. We did a podcast with Krish. I think it's W4VKU. He was on Andaman and Nicobar and Lakshadweep, and
Uh-huh.
he told us a story about he couldn't understand why his antennas weren't up in the morning, and he went down and there were these bootleggers that thought he was a policeman, and he was very concerned he was going to have an issue, and it turned out he didn't. But have you run into any interesting situations when you've been to other countries?
Well, it was actually the other way around. We did actually it was a record-setting um, contest effort from Coche Island, and we brought 44 verticals there. There was a hurricane, and it was a real challenge to keep them up. But when we went down there, they said, "Okay, here's a hotel. You can, you know, operate there." Well, the hotel was under construction. It was kind of like made out of bricks and adobe. No windows, no electricity. Their electricity was to throw a wire over the power line. So eventually we had to go get a generator and a guy to run the generator for our duration, and that had to come on a boat from the mainland. And it was the other way around. When we left, we had all of this string for holding up the verticals, and we gave it to all the fishermen because it was just perfect nylon string that they could use to fix their fishing nets with. And then, that kind of started me in thinking the ones I like are really cool when they leave something for the local people or plan on bringing something that, that can be useful, or they'll go and, fix some of the antennas, maybe the local police department or something like that
Right.
has got some broken stuff. Or you say, why are we bringing this coax back? Who can we, leave it with along the way? But, I think there was an expedition to Somalia, and they had the same problem. They put beverages out, and in the morning, it's like the wire was gone, and that would get stolen, kind of thing. So
Well, and
I've never,
I know if I asked Joe of your 63 DXpeditions, is there any place you would not go? And I know what your answer is.
Swings
And it's because,
of the heat.
yeah. So, Ralph, is there any place you would not return?
well, I mean, I haven't gone to any rare ones, but there's places where the people that are crossing the border at Texas are fleeing from, that maybe it's not terribly safe to go back anymore. Some of the Central American places,
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think only one time when I went to Belize, and that was enjoyable. But one day I decided I wanted to go see some of the Mayan ruins, and so I kind of took the bus to the border and walked across the border. And you're supposed to be able to find guys that had their cars, and they would be like taxi services, and so I said, okay, I wanted to go here. I told the guy how much money, it was going to be. And we go for a mile or so, and another guy gets in that knows him, and then go a bit more, and another guy gets in. And it's like me and four guys from Guatemala, and they're all speaking Spanish. And I'm starting to wonder, they know how much money I have. There's no reason they have to bring me to go see these Mayan ruins, type of thing. I was kind of worried about that. And, also when I went to Nicaragua, I thought, we get to the airport in Managua, and I'm probably about a foot and a half taller than the average guy down there, and I felt okay not knowing anything. But there are all these soldiers with machine guns in the airport.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, I thought they were there to control things, but you realize why they're there. And then, since I stood out, it's like, okay, you go and, they search all your bags when you're coming to country, and then you go to a separate table and they do it again. But I went about 50 miles in the middle of the night in an old junky van, and there were like, kids walking on the road and animals and stuff. And then they left me off at a gas station, and a little while later a pickup truck comes to get me from my host. And I'm thinking in retrospect, well, maybe I wouldn't do that today, like I did in the past,
Yeah.
that kind of stuff. So, I think I've been lucky. The places I went, we were scouted out really well and they were safe. But yeah, there's a lot of them now. I mean, look at Scarborough Reef or any of the stuff in the South China Sea. And I don't know. Well, I
Yeah,
did want to address your JAs are not as plentiful as you used to have. We used to just be able to run them on sideband, and then just the guys that knew English, you could just talk to those guys. And then, we saw the first Chinese station, and now that sometimes, on an FT8, there's a load of Chinese, and YB seems harder. They're a little further away. There's a resurgence of hams in Philippines. So there's more of those, but that's far away. Yeah, and when there's good propagation, you realize that there's a lot of them. But I agree, East and West um, are really difficult to get.
wow, very cool.
Yeah.
Well, all right. Well, thank you.
Oh,
My
you're
good.
welcome. I've
You,
certainly enjoyed it. Thanks to you guys for putting this together.
well, you've given us so much of your time. Now, the other two that we did, or the one that we did, I split in two. That'll drop next weekend.
Okay.
I try to spread them out, like, with FT8 Super Fox. I pushed that one out this last weekend. The weekend before that was Jarvis, because
Mhm.
those are both coming up. So we'll put improving your DX, and I know that's going to be a hit because there's so many good nuggets in there, and this will be really, really interesting for people to reflect on. And my dad used to say, he was into 6 meters and did some DXing on 10 and 6, and he would always say, if you hear that guy, you better working, because next time either you or he or both aren't going to be here. And
Yep.
it was a joke, but at the time it was like, all of a sudden East Germany's gone, and the Czechoslovakia is gone, and Yugoslavia is gone, and as much as we think it doesn't change that much, it does. So
Yep.
Yes.
There was one tidbit on W3LPL's propagation in the last month where, I've only heard maybe half a dozen Europeans on 6 meters this season, and two of them were GIs, and I got one decode, and I needed that for a new country. But he mentioned that we don't get as much sporadic E during sunspot highs as during the low. And that's hopeful, man. Maybe we'll get one little shot at some F2, but man, it's hard. I don't know what to do with antennas or how big to make stuff in order to work that next level. I was really fortunate to get the 100 countries, but maybe it's wait for sunspot lows again and do the multiple height of antennas, which
Yeah.
reminds me that um, my vertical, I counted up countries because of you, and I had 81 on 60 meters, and I have to work on some tuning, some top loading to get it to be perfect. But 60 meters is the hard band too, because it's like the same countries are there. There's no new ones.
Well,
Yeah.
if you would subscribe to the 60 meter newsletter that Joe has, that's good for another 20 or 25. I can guarantee it.
Yep.
Yeah,
Got it,
60,
man.
I
It's
always,
neat.
Ralph, I always said that 6, 60, and 160 are tough bands.
Yep.
It's got something to do with that 6 in there, I guess.
Yep.
Yeah, they're
Definitely.
all tough bands. And I've only worked one new country on 6 meters this season.
Wow.
Yeah, so it hasn't been very good for me. And that was a guy on Cook Island.
Yep. I'm
If
glad he was there because we had a couple openings and a bunch of guys got through.
So thanks again, Ralph. If you did not hear me, I really appreciate it. It was very interesting.
Oh, I enjoy it. I enjoy it. You guys are putting in a lot of effort, but to me, it's good for the guys that are learning this stuff. It's like, here's people that are on the air, and it's really interesting. I'm hoping that W4 VKU season, if we're going to be able to work him.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll have to see. All right, guys. Well, thanks very much. We'll be in touch, Ralph.
Good night.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.